Hi there. Please let your mind slow down and go at ease, and let me know in the comments where you're from. Also, what's your best tip for a peaceful night's sleep and keeping a calm mind? Whether it's a relaxing bedtime ritual, a favorite book, or a mindfulness practice, your advice could be just what someone needs. The haunting melody in the walls. It was a quiet evening in my apartment, and I was practicing guitar, preparing for an upcoming gig. I was alone, just letting myself get lost in the music, my fingers moving instinctively along the strings. The familiar notes filled the room, each one resonating through the quiet. I loved the solitude, the chance to dive into music without distraction. But then, as I paused for a moment, I noticed something odd, a faint melody drifting through the air, barely audible above the sound of my guitar. I stopped playing, my hands hovering over the strings, listening intently. The sound was faint, like someone playing an old piano, or maybe a violin, the notes echoing through the walls. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe a neighbor practicing late. But the music continued, a haunting melody that wound its way through the silence, seeming to grow clearer with every passing second. Curious, I set my guitar down and followed the sound. It seemed to come from the far end of the room, near a section of wall I'd never paid much attention to before. I pressed my ear against the plaster, straining to hear, and sure enough, the melody was coming from within the wall itself, as though someone was playing on the other side of it. The tune was eerie, a series of notes that seemed to sink into my bones, making my skin prickle. The walls felt unnaturally cold, and I hesitated, unsure of what to do. But curiosity tugged at me, and I couldn't resist. I began to examine the wall more closely, tapping at the plaster, searching for any sign of a hidden room or a way to access whatever lay behind it. After a few minutes, I found a loose panel near the floor, a faint seam barely visible in the dim light. Taking a deep breath, I pried it open. The panel gave way, revealing a narrow doorway that led into a small, dimly lit room. I squeezed through the opening, my heart pounding as I stepped into the strange space. It was like stepping into another world, a forgotten part of the building hidden away for who knows how long. Dust motes floated in the faint light, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic and faintly sharp. The room was filled with musical instruments, pianos, violins, cellos, and others I couldn't even name. They were old, their wooden frames cracked and covered in dust, but they looked like they had been arranged with care, each one facing a large, worn piano at the center of the room. And there, seated at the piano, was a figure, a translucent, ghostly form, its back to me as it played. The melody flowed from its fingers, haunting and hypnotic, each note sending a chill down my spine. The figure's movements were slow, deliberate, as though lost in its own world, completely unaware of my presence. I stood frozen, unable to tear my gaze away, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The figure's outline was faint, almost mist-like, its features blurred and indistinct. I could see the vague shape of a head, shoulders, hands moving over the keys, but nothing else. It was like watching a memory, a fragment of something long gone, yet somehow still alive. The music filled the room, wrapping around me, pulling me in, and I felt an overwhelming sadness settle over me. a weight pressing down on my chest. It was as if the melody held some ancient sorrow, a grief that echoed through the walls, reaching out from another time. But as I continued to watch, the music took on a darker tone. The notes became more discordant, harsh, and I felt a growing sense of unease, like something was shifting in the air, something that was turning its attention toward me. The figure's movements grew slower, more deliberate, and I realized with a chill that it was no longer lost in the music. It was aware of me. The ghostly figure stopped playing, its hands resting on the keys, frozen in place. Slowly it turned, and though its features were blurred, I could feel its gaze locking onto mine, cold and empty. A shiver ran through me as I took a step back, the room seeming to grow darker, the shadows deepening around us. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding as the silence thickened. The weight of its gaze was unbearable, like it was looking straight into my soul, stripping away every defense. I wanted to run, to break free from the trance that held me, but I couldn't move, couldn't tear myself away. Then, without warning, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, leaving only the cold, empty room and the silent instruments around me. The air felt heavy, charged with something dark and lingering, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the threshold as I backed out of the room. I raced back to my apartment, slamming the panel shut behind me, my hands shaking as I leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. My heart was pounding, my mind reeling with what I'd seen, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that some part of that ghostly presence had latched onto me, lingering in the shadows. For weeks afterward, I avoided that side of the apartment, unable to shake the memory of that haunting melody and the figure's hollow gaze. At night, I would hear faint strains of music drifting through the walls, the same melody echoing in the darkness, as if calling to me, beckoning me to return. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I had hallucinated the entire thing. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had opened something that should have stayed hidden, that I had awakened something dark and ancient that now watched me from the shadows. Even now, long after I moved out, I can still hear the faint notes of that melody in my mind, the haunting refrain playing over and over, a constant reminder of the figure waiting in the walls and the darkness that I will never fully escape. Let me know if you'd like me to continue with the next story, or if there are any specific adjustments you'd like. The Diner Special. I was on assignment, traveling through the Deep South, stopping at roadside diners to sample their dishes for a food column. It was a job that usually filled me with excitement, the thrill of trying new flavors, finding hidden culinary gems tucked away in small towns. That day, I had driven for hours, my GPS leading me through winding back roads, and just as dusk settled, I spotted a diner with a faded sign swinging gently in the evening breeze. The place was tucked off the main road, the kind of establishment that looked like it hadn't seen a remodel in decades. Its neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie greenish glow on the gravel parking lot. I felt a strange prickling at the back of my neck as I approached, but I brushed it off, chalking it up to road weariness and hunger. When I walked inside, I was struck by an overpowering smell, thick and heavy, a mixture of grease, spices, and something else, something metallic and almost decayed. The few patrons hunched over their plates gave me furtive glances, their eyes shifting back to their food as soon as they noticed me watching. An old jukebox in the corner played a faint, scratchy tune that seemed to echo hollowly through the room. I took a seat at the counter, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that clung to me like cobwebs. The server, a thin, hollow-cheeked man with a faded apron, approached me with a tight smile, his eyes never quite meeting mine. "What'll it be?" he asked, his voice gravelly and low. I scanned the chalkboard on the wall, which listed only one item, the daily special. There was no description, no details, just the words, "Today's special." I glanced at the server, hoping for some clue, but he simply stared at me, his expression unreadable. I'll take the special, I guess," I said, feeling a bit unnerved by the silence that settled over the diner as I placed my order. The server nodded and disappeared into the back. I drummed my fingers on the counter, glancing around the room. The other diners were quiet, hunched over their plates with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. None of them looked up or even acknowledged my presence. I tried to distract myself by checking my phone, but there was no signal out here, and I felt more isolated than ever. Finally, the server returned, placing a plate in front of me. I looked down, my appetite fading as I took in the sight. The food looked strange. It was a dark, almost black stew with chunks of unidentifiable meat floating in a thick, oily broth. The smell hit me immediately. Rich, metallic, and oddly bitter. I hesitated, but the server was watching me intently, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I took a tentative bite, forcing myself to chew. The taste was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Strong, earthy, with a faint metallic tang that lingered on my tongue. It wasn't exactly unpleasant, but something about it made my stomach churn. The server smiled as he watched me eat, his thin lips curving up in a way that seemed wrong, like he was savoring some private joke. I tried to smile back, but my mouth felt dry, my mind racing as I forced myself to take another bite. As I ate, a strange numbness began to creep over me, starting in my fingertips and slowly working its way up my arms. My vision blurred, and I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. I set my fork down, swallowing hard, as I tried to shake off the strange sensation. What's in this?" I managed to ask, my voice barely more than a whisper. The server's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with a cold satisfaction. "Just the finest ingredients," he said, his tone smooth and almost mocking. I pushed the plate away, a surge of nausea rising in my throat. The other patrons had stopped eating, their gazes fixed on me with an intensity that was both unsettling and predatory. I tried to stand, but my legs felt heavy, like they were anchored to the floor. Suddenly, a low, grating voice broke the silence. It was the owner, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a wicked smile. He leaned over the counter, his face close to mine, his breath hot and sour. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice dripping with false concern. "You haven't finished your meal." Panic surged through me as I tried to pull away, but the owner grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. His fingers dug into my skin, and I could feel my pulse quicken, my heart hammering as he leaned closer. "Don't worry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We make sure our guests always get the full experience." I tried to break free, but my limbs felt heavy, my vision tunneling as a wave of weakness washed over me. My senses felt dulled, my mind clouded as the diners closed in, their expressions twisted with an almost feral hunger. I realized, with a sickening lurch, that I wasn't just a customer. I was part of the meal. Just as my vision started to fade, the door burst open and a group of locals rushed in, their faces grim and determined. They stormed the diner, shouting for me to get up, pulling me away from the counter as the owner and server stepped back, their faces twisting into expressions of rage. One of the locals grabbed my arm, dragging me toward the door. "You need to get out of here. Now," he said, his voice urgent. I stumbled out of the diner, my mind still reeling, my body trembling as I leaned against one of the cars in the lot. The locals surrounded me, their faces filled with a strange mixture of pity and horror. They didn't say anything, just watched as I tried to catch my breath, the night air cold and bracing against my skin. I managed to ask them what had happened, what the diners inside were really eating. One of the locals shook his head, his expression grave. "It's best you don't ask," he said quietly. "Some things are better left unknown." They drove me to the nearest town, where I found myself in a daze, still unable to shake the taste of that strange, metallic stew from my mouth. The memory of the diner's hungry eyes haunted me, and I knew that whatever I tasted, it was something I would never forget. To this day, I can't pass by a roadside diner without feeling a shiver run down my spine. And even now, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, the taste of that stew lingering on my tongue, the memory of those empty, hungry eyes watching me in the dark. The farmhouse encounter. It was supposed to be a routine welfare check. As a social worker, I'd handled countless cases in isolated rural areas, but something felt different this time. I had been assigned to visit a family out in the country, a call that had come in as urgent, though the details were vague. The drive was long, the road winding deeper and deeper into the woods, taking me further from the familiar city lights and safety. By the time I arrived, dusk had fallen, casting a grim, dim light over the landscape. The farmhouse came into view, an old structure nestled among sprawling fields. There was an eerie stillness to the place, a quiet that hung heavy in the air. As I pulled into the driveway, I felt a chill, an instinctual wariness settling in. The farmhouse looked abandoned, windows dark and lifeless, the front door swinging slightly in the breeze. Stepping out of my car, I glanced around, noting signs of a struggle, Furniture was overturned on the porch, and what looked like a faint smear of dried blood stained one of the wooden beams. I hesitated, my heart beginning to race as I considered going back to the car and calling for backup. But I pushed the thought aside, reminding myself that I was here to help. "Hello," I called, my voice breaking the silence. Only the echo of my words answered back, fading into the vast emptiness surrounding the farmhouse. I took a deep breath and cautiously approached the door, the wood creaking as I pushed it open. The interior was dark, the air thick with the smell of dust and something else, something metallic and sour. I took a few steps inside, my footsteps echoing in the vast, empty silence. The place looked as though it had been ransacked. Furniture lay scattered, drawers pulled open, and papers littered the floor. Every step I took seemed to stir up the dust, sending it swirling in the dim light from the single flickering bulb that hung in the hallway. I called out again, my voice softer this time, wary of what or who might be lurking in the shadows. Silence answered once more, but then I heard it, a faint sound, barely audible, like someone sobbing. My blood ran cold, and I froze, straining to listen. The sound seemed to be coming from upstairs, the soft, pitiful cries drifting down from the darkened staircase. With every step, the creaking of the old wooden stairs seemed to echo louder, the sound amplifying the eerie quiet that surrounded me. My heart pounded as I climbed, and the cries grew louder, more distinct. I reached the landing and followed the sound to a small bedroom at the end of the hall. I pushed the door open slowly, and there, huddled in the corner, was a young girl. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes wide with fear. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mixture of relief and terror. I took a step forward, speaking to her in a soothing tone, trying to calm her. "What happened here?" I asked softly, crouching down to her level. But she only shook her head, too frightened to speak, her gaze darting nervously toward the door as if she expected someone to burst in at any moment. I felt a surge of protectiveness, a need to get her out of this nightmare, and I reached out, gently taking her hand. "It's okay," I whispered. "I'm here to help. We're going to get out of here." But as I helped her to her feet, a sound echoed from downstairs, a low, deliberate creak, like someone stepping across the floor. My breath caught, and I felt a surge of dread. I squeezed the girl's hand tighter, motioning for her to stay quiet. Together, we backed toward the window, my eyes fixed on the open doorway, half expecting to see a shadowy figure appear. The footsteps grew louder, ascending the stairs, each creak sending a wave of terror through me. Whoever was coming was taking their time, each step slow and deliberate, as though savoring the fear that gripped us. I glanced around the room, my mind racing. There was no way out except the window, but we were on the second floor, too high for a safe jump. The girl clung to me, trembling, her wide eyes filled with silent pleas for help. I wrapped an arm around her, my heart hammering as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs. The shadow of a figure appeared in the doorway, and I felt a surge of panic, every instinct screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The figure stepped into the room, a man with hollow, dark eyes and a twisted smile, that chilled me to my core. His clothes were ragged, stained with dirt and something darker, something that looked disturbingly like blood. He tilted his head, regarding us with a cold, unsettling gaze. "Leaving so soon?" he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper, but the malice in it was unmistakable. My pulse thundered as I pressed myself and the girl back against the wall, desperately searching for a way out. The man took a step closer, his movements slow, deliberate, like a predator savoring its prey. I felt trapped, suffocated by the walls that seemed to close in around us, the darkness pressing down like a heavy shroud. But just as he moved closer, there was a sudden commotion from downstairs. The sound of voices, of footsteps pounding through the house. I didn't dare look away from the man in front of us, but I could hear someone calling out my name, their voice filled with urgency. The man's expression twisted into a snarl, and he backed away, his dark eyes flashing with anger. He shot me a final furious look before turning and disappearing down the hallway, his footsteps retreating into the shadows. A moment later, 2 police officers appeared in the doorway, their flashlights illuminating the room. Relief flooded over me as I recognized them, their faces grim but familiar. They rushed over, helping us out of the room and down the stairs, their voices calm and reassuring. As we made our way outside, I glanced back at the farmhouse, half expecting to see the man's face in one of the windows, watching us leave. But the house was dark, silent, as though it had swallowed him up, leaving no trace of the horror that had unfolded within its walls. The girl clung to me as we walked to the waiting police car, her small body trembling against mine. I held her close, whispering words of comfort, but inside I felt shaken to my core, haunted by the man's twisted smile and the cold, empty darkness of that farmhouse. I later learned that the farmhouse had a dark history, one that locals spoke of in hushed tones. The family that had once lived there had vanished under mysterious circumstances, and rumors of strange happenings had kept people away for years. The farmhouse had become a ghost story, a place avoided by those who knew better. And now I understand why. That night, as I lay in bed, trying to erase the memory of the man's cold eyes and the girl's terrified face, I realized that some places are marked by darkness, cursed to remain haunted, their secrets buried in shadow. And no matter how far I run, I know I'll never forget that farmhouse, or the feeling of being trapped, helpless, as the darkness closed in.